actually.
There we are. There we are. That's so much better.
It's actually crazy
Hi.
how much better it works. I don't know why there's any other options for doing this.
Who can say? Who can ever say what TikTok does?
Well, welcome. It's so good to see
Oh,
you. I
it's
apologize to
so.
everybody watching out there. This is a little delayed.
Hey, that's my fault. Don't.
I wasn't going to put you on the spot, but
Oh
yes, it
no,
was your fault. Now
I'll
everybody
own
knows.
up to that. I'll own up to that super quick. That's a my bad.
Well,
Don't
we are.
work in theater, kids.
Yeah, I get
That's
it. I
my
get
lesson.
it. Well, we are going to be discussing the truly wonderful Kieron Gillen, Stephanie Hahn's comic "Die" from Image
God, we
Comics,
are
"Unalive" from Image Comics.
unalive. We don't know how to talk about the title without the TikTok community guidelines getting mad at us. So I think we're just gonna have to like try and work our way around it as much as we possibly can.
We should just call it
But
Dice.
there we go. We'll call it Dice.
Because we have 4 volumes, so it's Dice. It's no longer a single volume.
True.
Yeah.
True.
One of my favorite things about it, and it's one of those things that like sometimes I get mad at Kieron Gillen because I'm like, you just think you're so fucking clever, don't you?
I'm mad at Kieron Gillen all the time. Are you kidding me?
So for those,
no, for the exact same reason. I'm just like,
right.
You are so smart, and it makes me so angry. You're really good at this, and I don't like that you're good at this.
But even just the structure of the comic itself, because it's 4 volumes, and for anyone who's never seen the trades, that's indicated by a D4 symbol. And so the smallest die.
Yeah, and then there's
20 issues.
And then there's 20 issues total, and like you
motherfucker. Yeah, it's so funny.
I'm so glad you're cursing because I was so worried about my ability to curse on this, and now I feel like okay, great.
Cut loose. Go for it.
I don't want to make people mad when I curse. It's gonna happen, kids. It's just gonna happen.
I don't give a shit. It's fine. So yeah, if you haven't read this before, we'll probably.
I haven't actually. I've never read it.
Oh wow, crazy! I mean, I'm more talking to the audience, but now I know you've actually never read it. This will be very
no. This is a bold departure for your format. No, of course I've read it multiple times at this point.
Well, we will probably be straight up spoiling it. So maybe we'll try to avoid spoilers at least in the beginning, but I think we're gonna eventually hit a point where we'll just start spoiling the whole thing.
Yeah, because I really don't know how deep you can go into this,
right,
without getting into some of the big meta stuff that happens. And
absolutely, yeah. And I'd like to dig into, because rereading it for this, I was like, reading it all in one chunk, it really changes your whole perspective and experience with the text, I feel.
And I'll tell you, reading it sort of for an academic purpose, for lack of a better term, or a critical purpose, I had read the first 2 volumes before we decided to do this, and then I was like, well, I guess if we're going to do this, I'm just going to pick up the other 2 because I already wanted to pick them up. So reading the first 2 just kind of casually, like as a reader, and then reading the last 2 as like, okay, I need to get into this and I need to like zone in. I'm currently having to use 2 of them as a stand for my ring light, so there's
getting put to good use.
Yeah, they're getting their use out, but yeah.
So ordinarily what I do when I have these talks with people is I start off by asking, how did you get into comics? But I'm going to ask a slightly different question for this particular chat, which is, going into this series, were you, and I now know the answer to this based on our DM conversations leading into this, but what was your experience with like tabletop role-playing games before you started even reading this comic?
Yeah, so I started playing RPGs. I played a little bit in a couple of like campaigns that just never quite got off the ground when I was a senior in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I went to my community college, I got very, very lucky, and I found a few people who we started meeting once a week, and then we started meeting twice a week, and we've now been meeting once or twice a week every week for the last 5 years almost.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, that's kind of like, that was like my big introduction to it, at least.
Sure. So your role playing is primarily with Dungeons and Dragons, or have you tried other games?
5e primarily, but we've tried some other systems before, things like that. I'm currently bullying them. I'm like, just letting you know when this inevitably comes out, I'm gonna bully all of you into like trying it with me.
The Die RPG.
The Die RPG, which I believe just ended its Kickstarter
Yeah,
campaign.
fairly recently. Fairly recently.
Yeah, you can find beta rules of it online, but
Yeah,
gonna
you
be
can
an
play
actual
pretty.
like official one coming out in like August,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
which is exciting.
So some context for anybody out there who's watching this and has never maybe read the comic. The elevator pitch of it that I often give to people, which I realize is like a very reductive pitch, but I feel like it's the simplest way to explain the plot, is it's Jumanji with Dungeons and Dragons. It's about a group of people when they are young teenagers who get sucked into a tabletop RPG game that their friend created, and then they reappear. How many years later is it? It's a significant.
Two,
It's 2 years later initially, right? Or is it three?
yeah,
It's a
it's
few
two.
years later. Yeah, and then we flash forward about 20-ish years,
Yeah, like
30
20 to
years.
25, I think.
Yeah, to them as adults, and they are essentially pulled back into the game to finish what they started.
Yeah,
Um, and it's a like many Kieron Gillen comics, his indie comics especially. Oh,
I'm okay. We're alive.
you're good. You're good. But like many Kieron Gillen comics, especially his indie comics, it's as much as it is a story, it is also about a hobby. Like
Mm-hmm.
phonogram is like there is a story there, but it's also about being a passionate fan of music.
It's Kieran Gillen's like love letter to Britpop.
Yes, exactly,
And
exactly. And Die functions in a very similar way, where it is Kieran Gillen's love letter to tabletop RPGs and really the concept of gaming in general, but really very specifically tabletop RPGs.
yeah, and I before jumping into this and like doing my little bit of research, I didn't know Kieran Gillen was a games journalist
Yes.
before going into the comic book world, which it's like it's not quite Tom King was a CIA agent, but it was definitely like this makes a lot of sense. A
I don't know
revelation
why
that
that made
like
me laugh so much, but it
no,
really did.
it's funny. No,
Oh, that's amazing.
when you find out Tom King was a CIA agent, you're like,
A
oh,
lot of this makes sense. Yeah. It's like,
this makes
oh,
a lot of sense now.
he's just sad about the Iraq War. I get
Yeah,
it. I get it now.
but
I see what's
but
happening here.
yeah, but I so obviously Kieran Gillen has thought a lot about like the nature of games and what
Yes.
games mean and how people play games and why people play games, and so I think putting all of that in a comic book. My TikTok is telling me to take a break. Putting all of that in a comic book is really ingenious and smart,
Sure.
and stupid idiot thinks he's so smart,
Well,
thinks he
it's
knows what he's
interesting too.
talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting too because I feel like we often get. I feel like metatext in fictional storytelling is not that it's like old hat, but it's something we're accustomed to, right? Like I think
Yeah.
people have been doing metafictional stories for a very long time now, whether it's in comic books, in regular fiction, whatever the case may be. I don't know how often you see metafictional gaming, which is ironic because there literally is a
Mm-hmm.
concept called metagame, a term called metagaming,
Right.
but you rarely have someone trying to create a game that is about the process of playing a game itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it does you in. I actually played the beta version of Die with my D&D group, and it's a pretty emotional experience playing that game.
I can imagine, and certainly, like I said, I've been trying to bully my friends into playing it, and we've been playing games together for 5 years now. So it's like when you start dealing with the metatextual elements of like why people play games, and certainly the comic touches on like some people play games for escape, some people play games for power fantasies, some people play games for just a need to connect with people, and it's you know, once you actually start delving into that in the context of a game, it's like everything starts looping over and over and over again until you just get really sad. And this book makes me very sad in a good way, but like it does by the end of it, and we'll get into I think probably a little bit of gender feel, but that element which we'll probably touch on is certainly there, and Yeah, I mean, again, Kieron Gillen,
Well,
I think, is really smart about talking about why people play these things.
definitely. And not only that, I think what's fun about this comic is that even though I think the baseline of it is rooted in Dungeons and Dragons, which again, getting back to Kieran Gillen being too clever for his own good, I think is appropriate considering Dungeons and Dragons is such a linchpin of the tabletop
Mm-hmm.
role playing game, community, especially in our modern times. Um, but it takes the time to dip into other genres. Like there's references to Call of Cthulhu and H.P. Lovecraft stuff. There's references to Tolkien's writing in general. There's references to H.G. Wells. There's references to the
Mm-hmm.
Brontes. But it's all tying into this really interesting history of how tabletop role playing came together. And yet you're also seeing like all the different elements of Dungeons and Dragons. Because I think what I
Mm-hmm.
like about 5e especially, but Dungeons and Dragons I like in the same way I like superhero comics, which is that it's every genre at once. Like
Yeah.
you could do something that's just straight fantasy. You could do something that's more horror influenced. You can find ways
Mm-hmm.
to include sci-fi elements. Like there's all sorts of ways you can mix and match genres within tabletop role playing game and have it all hang together and make sense in a
Yeah.
way few other texts or whatever can recreate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, again, the principle, and that kind of gets to the core of this, which again, it's like the first moment of the comic book is like going over every die
Yeah.
a traditional um in a traditional RPG set. And I have some this is like the one moment where I was like, oh, I need to take a note on this because I have thoughts and feelings about the dice and the symbolism of the dice
Yeah,
and
let's
things.
go over
But
that because
we'll
I
maybe
thought a
get
good
into
way
that a
to
little
sort of
bit
have
later.
this I thought a good way to have this conversation is to kind of talk a little bit about each character and what they represent, because I feel like that's probably the easiest way to go through this story. So, what were you going to say about the die themselves and what they represent?
Well, and certainly when you look at the RPG system, it kind of expands upon this. Um, so the D4, the dictator, Ash, I find the D4 to be a very troublesome die. And in addition, it's traditionally the damage die of like a dagger or
Sure.
something that you don't use to necessarily fight head to head with, but
Right.
something that you use as a means of acquiring political influence and things like that. And in a very real way, threats. And I think assigning, Ash the sort of barred from hell role with the powers of a dictator
Right.
is fascinating. Um, so the D6, Chuck, the Fool. The big thing I noted was when you play the die RPG, it's a D6 based system. So when you're like, here's the one die that is the same as every other die, but it's also special, but it's like, filling in that sort of everyman archetype. And then of course,
Mm,
I think when we get into the nature of Chuck's character and how Chuck clearly plays these games as a form of power fantasies,
yeah.
and sort of that element I think is interesting.
Not to mention
Um,
that the D6 is the everyman of dice. It's the
right. It's
die. It's the die that appears the most frequently in any board game or whatever. If you say to someone dice, like that's what's going to be conjured up in their mind when they think of that.
yeah. The line in that one of those first pages is Saul says to Chuck, "Of course you are fool. You get this entirely normal D6," which I do find very funny. Um, as far as the D8 goes, obviously the eight emotion wheel is a big part of the comic, but then also the D8 is your classic longsword damage die. So again, sort of playing into the idea of like the knight wielding the sword, and then Matt being the grief knight, and again the sort of eight emotions is kind of a big part of vague elements of some psychological elements, but then also just like in general that idea, which I find very fascinating.
Sure.
Um, the D10 is, of course, for Angela, who is playing like the one character that everyone's like, "What are you doing here?" Like we're all playing these classic fantasy archetypes, and you're sitting over here as a cyberpunk.
Right.
And the D10 being a non-platonic solid, the one die that is not a platonic solid, it
Sure.
does have it doesn't fit in the sort of span of the rest of the dice
Right. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
fascinating. Um, and then the D12, 12 is often a very relevant religious number. So when you assign it to the cleric class, essentially of Godbinder, that obviously carries a lot of religious significance. And then of course the D20 being the role of the game master as the
Right.
classic D20 decision die that can manipulate its own rules.
And talking again about like D4, like 4 and 20, 4 volumes of the series, and then 20 issues total. There's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting sort of push and pull. I think even though it is a balanced game, there is this sort of thing where you're kind of like Dictator might be like the most powerful character in this in a
Right.
sense, or at least we're biased that way because Ash is ostensibly the protagonist of the series, right?
Yeah.
So there's that sort of like yin and yang, to be cliche, but like the smallest and the largest, what we see as the weakest and what we see as the most powerful, being almost
Right.
direct at odds with one another within the story of the comic.
Yeah, no, and again, this is another thing of Kieron Gillen thinking that he's so smart. I feel like this is eventually just gonna become the roast of Kieron Gillen of just like, I love you, and you think you're so clever, you're so good at this, and I
He
hate that you're
is.
so good at this. He
He
is
really
really good
is.
at this. I'm a stan for life. I'll read pretty much anything he writes. I chose this comic because I wanted to talk about Kieron Gillen, but I didn't want to make you read all like 60 odd issues of Wictive again.
Well,
You
I mean, I have a strong enough memory of a lot of these things that I could
you
probably touch
you
on
had
them all.
just had a child when we were first talking about this, and I was like, I'm not going to make you read 60 issues of this series. I can ask you to read 20. I won't ask you to read 60.
It's one of those things where like I have definitely found that I'm a pretty good, because I read a lot. Like
Mm-hmm.
obviously I have a very large bookshelf behind me. I've read a lot of stuff and I can't retain all of it, but I know enough and remember enough that I can kind of bullshit my way through a conversation about a lot of things, or be like,
Fair.
oh, remind me what this is again, and then I'll kind of go from there, you know.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right that like what I appreciate so much about Kieron Gillen's work, and in the context of Die specifically, is there's a depth of knowledge to what he's talking about that always catches me off guard. Like
Mm-hmm.
I knew nothing about, I knew about the sort of like H.G. Wells like creating the war games and stuff like that, that kind of are the precursor to a lot of the
Yeah.
rules that become Dungeons and Dragons. That I knew about, but all the stuff with the Brontes, I was like, what the hell is this? Like I
Yeah, no,
didn't know any of that stuff.
I didn't know any of that, and I was like, "Where in the world is this going?" And then you're
Right.
like, "Oh, oh, you just did the research, is what you did."
And it's interesting the way it kind of becomes this grand unified theory of gaming by the end of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where he's sort of like, you have the sort of like role play elements of this world that the Brontes were creating, and like the gothic fiction of that goes with the rigid rules of H.G. Wells, and those all come merging together to create these larger worlds that people are building every time they sit down and play a tabletop role playing game.
Yeah, and then of course the bookends of those two kind of being Tolkien and Lovecraft as sort of
Right,
the two big influences on the fiction of something like classic Dungeons and Dragons, where it's
right.
like there's elves and dwarves and goblins, and then there's also unknowable horrors beyond our comprehension that you that you can play with.
Yeah, because
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
well, and I think would have been it would have been so easy to take the easy way out and just like make H.R. Geiger or not H.R. Geiger, not
H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft. No, created Dungeons and Dragons. Last
Oh,
name
Gary
Gary
Gygax.
Gygax. I was
There
like,
you
what? Who am I talking about again? It would have been so easy to make Tolkien or Lovecraft Gary Gygax,
go. Right, right.
but Kieron Gillen choosing to not do that, I think, and really get into the origins of these games was, I mean, very smart, and again, not taking the easy way out, which I thought great.
Which I think makes sense because like yes, Gary Gygax creates what's known as Dungeons and Dragons, but it's all building on things that came before him,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, he gets credit for creating the concept of the brand Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
but it's not. It's all rooted in so much already existing fiction
Mm-hmm.
ideas and concepts that you kind of can't say he invented it whole cloth.
Right.
there's too much there.
Yeah.
What I think is also interesting is when I first started reading it, um, the issue that's sort of like they're in the big the analogous World War I space,
Yeah.
and you have the hobbits in the trenches and
Mm-hmm.
all that. And at first glance, I assumed that the rest of the comic was going to almost be like planetary, where like every issue, every 2 issues or so, you would basically jump into another genre of
Mm-hmm.
tabletop role playing game. The same way Planetary is all like, let's explore all the types of pre superhero pulp fiction that existed.
Right.
Um, and I was pleasantly surprised to be wrong. Don't get me wrong, but it is interesting seeing the way he blends in the existing archetypes that we're familiar with to build out the world of Die itself and slowly reveal to us what exactly is going on. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, again, I think this is the thing that I've always kind of noticed about Kieron Gillen's work, and what I really like about it is, again, it's like he doesn't take the easy way out when you do these
Right.
things. It would be so easy to make a book like this just like Planetary, but instead we're gonna, you know, this is a character driven story at its
Yes.
core, and
Absolutely.
this is not necessary. We're not trying to necessarily do big concept riffs on 87 different concepts. We're gonna explore the one concept of like, why do people play games, and we're just gonna like really delve into it with these characters and this world and the questions that are raised about I guess role-playing games in general, but like, the sense of communities and ideas that grow out around these things.
Right, and the spoilers for the end of the book, when they find the Grand Master and he's revealed to be the game itself, and the question he always poses is, "What am I for?"
Yeah.
It's the book really being very literal in its thesis of like this is a comic about why we play games and trying
subtlety
to answer
is
that question.
subtlety is overrated, and
In this day and age, absolutely.
truthfully, I think sometimes you do just need a big guy with a big sentient D20 head showing up and asking what he's for to
I've seen the
handle
way
the.
people on the internet talk about the boys. People need to be less subtle, apparently.
I don't. So this is where I confess my sin of I have not watched season 3 of The Boys, because The
I
Boys.
haven't watched any of it, so don't worry.
Oh, okay, good. I was like, I watched the first 2 seasons and I really like it, but like there's I can only handle so much in
Yeah,
terms
no.
of. I was like, this is too much for me. But
I can
anyways,
only handle so much, and my amount is 0.
fair, fair enough.
And I appreciate
Fair enough.
what I've heard about it, which is like it maybe softens the edges isn't the right word, but it has more to say than the Garth Ennis comic did. But I'm still just kind of
Well,
like, I just can't right now.
well, how much did the Garth Ennis comic really have to say?
Right, which it's a low bar that has
We
been
need to.
set.
We can't talk about The Boys here. One of us is gonna get attacked on the internet because we said we don't watch it or don't like it.
Come
We
at
need
me.
to,
I don't want to pay for Amazon Prime. You're just supporting Vought Industries or whatever it is.
you are
They've
support
controlled
you
your
are
mind,
literally
people. Wake up.
you are literally supporting. Okay, anyways.
Anyway, this is live. Don't oversee it. It's fine. But let me ask you this question.
Okay.
Because you mentioned something interesting that I would love to dig into with you a moment ago, which is the idea of like gender identity and how that plays into this
Yeah.
comic. And
So yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say I have had multiple friends who, over the course of my playing RPGs with them, have discovered have sort of come into their own gender identities
Mm-hmm.
through the playing of role playing games, and I was like, oh, I'm glad Kieron Gillen has touched on this, because I have had it happen to me multiple times.
Right, right.
And it's always nice. I mean, it's always nice to see it happen, but I appreciate the fact that it doesn't end on a very like clean cut note. I think it would be easy for, oh, Ash realizes their own gender identity within the game, and so when they come out of the game, they have it all figured out, and the magic of the game somehow made them transition just automatically, and it's like the sort of ending of the book, which we're just gonna have to go full spoilers at this point.
Do it.
The ending of the book sort of saying Dominic slash Ash is finally ready to go on this journey that they've
Yeah.
clearly been suppressing for the last 27 years. Is It's just lovely. It's just like I think it's a very good important moment, and sort of the recognition of that, and the space role playing games give for people to explore those elements of themselves is very important. Like I said, I've had multiple friends who it's like they had initially identified as male, played a couple of RPGs playing women characters, and then they were like, "Oh, I realized this thing about me,
Sure.
which I really should have figured out earlier because of this." And now it's just it's a nice thing to see. And
Yeah.
Kieron Gillen's comics are always really queer in a way that I appreciate, but that was, I think, a different way to explore it in a way other than in a way that's opposed to, like, say, his Young Avengers run, where it's like we're all gay and that's okay and we like being gay.
Right.
Um,
Well, and I think that is what makes the experience of playing, especially, I find this is especially true now in modern, not just D&D, but TTRPG spaces, is how much of an effort is being put forth to make it a more inclusive space. And I think it's for the exact reasons that you're describing, because it gives opportunities to people to play with gender and sexual orientation in a safe, controlled way that
mhm.
society does not typically allow. And also, you get to fight dragons, which is like
Yeah.
pretty sick too. But
And when you play die, the dragon is actually your own suppressed feelings about your sexual orientation or your gender
the
identity.
dragons are always gender dysphoria, is what
The
we're
the demon is your gender dysphoria in die, which
exactly. Well, and
which
I've
again,
had very
subtlety is
similar,
overrated.
yeah,
Subtlety is overrated.
absolutely. And I've had very similar experiences to what you were describing, where we have this joke at my school, because I run the Dungeons and Dragons club at my school, and the kids always joke around that, like, the Dungeons and Dragons club is also the, like, GSA of the school, because so many of them are, like, in the LGBT community in some capacity. Because I think there is just something to be said about the game. I don't know if this is something you've given a lot of thought to. What is your take on all of this? Do you think there's a particular reason as to why, especially because it had such
Gay
hetero,
people love role
uninclusive
playing.
roots?
Gay people love role playing, and I'm going to say this as a gay theater maker who plays Dungeons and Dragons. No, that's kind of the number one thing. But I mean, again, it's exactly what you said, where it's like, spaces that actively encourage open exploration of your own identity um, are important
Mhm.
and necessary. And if you find that through role playing games, or you find it through theater, which is kind of the two places that I know it best, certainly, um, it's a good and important thing. That's really just the big thing. Is like it's exactly what you said. Safe spaces to explore these aspects are important. And I think the element of, there's, I mean, again, we're now going to have to get back into why people play games. The elements of escapism, and sort of saying, like, oh, in a game like this, it in the sense of both the escapism and the power fantasy, it's like, in a game like this, I can be so fully myself, and
Mm,
I don't have to think about what other people would think about whether it's my own journey or my own expression or anything like that is
totally.
good and important and necessary.
Yeah.
RPGs save lives, kids. I mean, they're no, I mean, genuinely, I've seen so many people talking about, like, oh, I volunteer at, youth clinics and we play RPGs. I don't know if you've seen it, but, like, there's
Yeah.
now been, like, people have been starting programs to, like, they people go in and they play RPGs with incarcerated people, and it's like these are important spaces to provide fuel for people's creativity, as well as, maybe helping them figure some things out in the real
For
world.
sure. And when we're talking about the meta aspect of it too, I almost feel as though that there's something to be said about the fact that it's cliche to say this, but when you're playing a tabletop role playing game with Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, you're building a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ultimate goal, I think, of any story is to provide an audience with an emotional catharsis, whether that's an emotional catharsis because you've reached the exciting conclusion of that particular tale, or a catharsis that's more personal, that like, oh, this story has helped me to learn and understand something better about myself. And it's almost like, well, what better way to find a catharsis than a story that you're creating on your own? And you don't even have to be a great writer or filmmaker or whatever to do that in a tabletop role playing game, because you have the assistance of the people that you're with and the game master, whoever they may be, but you are finding a catharsis. So it seems strange on paper, but it makes total sense that people are doing it in these ways that are meant to be more therapeutic or helping people to be more outspoken or build social skills. It totally makes sense that now we've moved to the space because it is a way to guide people in a controlled environment.
Yeah, and certainly these aspects have only gotten grander because of the introduction of actual play RPG
Right.
streams on Twitch, and the Stranger Things effect that people have talked about, of like, no, Stranger Things actually did like bring a whole bunch of people into wanting to
Yeah.
play games like this. And you know the proliferation of it is so important. And of course, as things expand, you get more shitty people. But
Well,
I
and the ironic thing is that Dungeons and Dragons started with shitty people. Like,
yeah,
you read about what Gary Gygax's opinions are, and
I'm
they're
not
bad.
a yeah, I'm not. I think anybody who tries to be like a D&D purist and is like, this isn't what Gary Gygax wanted, I'm like, I don't think we should be thinking about what Gary Gygax wants anymore.
Gary Gygax wanted a game that is probably not very fun to play, if I'm being brutally honest with you.
No,
Just in terms of a rule standpoint,
he
purely.
didn't. I've tried to explain people the concept of THACO, and even my RPG friends are like, "You're gonna need to stop talking right now." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yep, fair
I
enough."
don't understand how the game survived as long as it did with the rules it used to have.
It,
It's
who can
honestly shocking to me.
it truly truly is. My
But it is. Yeah, sorry,
a
go ahead.
deep core memory of mine was our last session of the first campaign that I ran and completed with my group that I played. We went to an arcade, like a local arcade that had a Dungeons and Dragons room set up, and this dude pulls out like a box and he has all of his old modules in it. And I'm like reading through it, and I was like, this makes no sense. But I was like, that's impressive. He told me, I don't know if you play Magic the Gathering, but he was like, no, I put the down payment for this thing on a beta Black Lotus. And I was like, okay. That's like the nerdiest thing I've ever heard. I don't, like I said, I don't know if you played Magic the Gathering, but
I do not play Magic the Gathering. No, there are
no,
some nerd Rubicons that even I will not cross.
don't do it. It's a bad idea, and I don't recommend it.
Luckily, I spend too much money on comic books to ever invest in Magic the Gathering.
God, me too. Look it up. Look it
Well,
up.
and I don't know if you feel this way, but thinking about talking about this comic and talking about gender inclusivity in the game, I almost wonder if Dungeons and Dragons is one of the few geek spaces, and maybe I'm wrong because maybe I'm just like I have a myopic view of it, because compared to my other like nerdy passions, I'm not as, how can I put this? I'm not as like in. No, I like Dungeons and Dragons a lot. I'm not as in touch with the community of Dungeons and Dragons. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? But what I'm trying to say is, I almost feel like Dungeons and Dragons has succeeded more at pushing out the morons, not fully, but more than like say comic books have.
Oh, I think absolutely they have, and I think for starters, I think it's the fact that, um, in comparison to say comic books, there's just a lot more prominent women in that space. Not to say
Sure.
that there aren't, not to say that there aren't prominent women in comic book spaces, but certainly maybe not as visual in the sense that, it takes a lot for, say, a comic book writer to really break out into like a big name. But like for an RPG streamer, certainly I think having, I think just the spaces allowing for like more inclusive voices is important. There's tons of actual plays out there where it's like it's a table, but we're all women, or we're all people of color, or we're all queer,
Right.
or like we're creating individualized spaces within ourselves, and the exposure to other people is probably just a good thing overall. Turns out when
Right.
you meet people from these backgrounds or interact with these people from these backgrounds, you're like, oh, I can interact with these people and feel like okay and safe. And maybe you watch something, you watch an actual play like that, and you're like, oh, okay, this community is clearly more welcoming. And I do think, frankly, I do just think that the fact that the community has gotten so much bigger and therefore so much more diverse is like we, the tolerance for bullshit is at an all-time low. We're just
Right.
like don't
And still
don't
far from perfect, but it
oh
is
yeah.
it is an interesting thing. Like it is. I'm gonna sidebar for a second here, and then but there is a point to this. I remember when the Kamala Khan Miss Marvel comics first came out, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
remember because I was there day one. I bought that first issue the day it came out, and I remember like the classic like oh, go broke or whatever variation of it was there was
Yeah.
back in like what is it almost 10 years ago now
Yeah,
over
no one's gonna read this. It's
right
like
exactly.
not gonna.
And now here we are. She's got the Disney Plus show, and in my mind, I was like, "Wow, this Disney Plus show will shut up all the naysayers. Like, and finally prove them wrong." And then I look at like the Instagram comics on comments on any Marvel Entertainment post about Miss Marvel. It's just the most god awful dreck I've ever seen in my life. And I'm like, how are we still doing this almost over 10 years after this comic came out? And I think that because there have been the actual plays, and I hadn't thought about this till you were bringing up the actual plays so much in just a moment ago, but I think the actual plays being largely inclusive
Mm-hmm.
has had a huge impact on cutting out the morons because
Yeah,
the inclusive uh, nature of the actual plays that brought in so many people brought in people with similar mindsets,
yeah,
ergo you don't have as many like chodes who are jumping in and being dickheads to everybody. Now
right.
that again still exists for sure, but I feel very strongly that like it doesn't feel as prevalent as it is in comic book spaces, for example.
Absolutely. And I think, like I said, I do think it kind of comes down to visibility.
Mm,
You just by the nature of their mediums, you don't get to see like G. Willow Wilson and Sana Amanat like talking about the creation of Miss Marvel, for example.
mm-hmm.
Whereas when you watch an actual play, you're seeing all of these like women and people of
Sure.
color and queer people
Yeah.
like actually engaging in the thing. And like I said, I think it's just a case of the medium. And also I think, certain fandom cultures, I think D&D, because the proliferation of D&D was so fast, like it happened
Yeah.
so quickly over literally just the last 5 to 7 years or so.
I often say Dungeons and Dragons is the only company that benefited from the pandemic in a serious way. Like
Yes,
they're the only ones who are like, we're doing great. This is terrific for us.
yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I think it was just because it was so quick is probably another reason. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Totally, totally, yeah, yeah.
we, we
It's
can't
fascinating.
solve the problems with fandom in our one little discussion. But I hope we can maybe get a little closer.
I think we figured it out. I think we nailed it. I think everything's
Great.
fine.
Yeah, I think we solved it.
No, but it is just a fascinating thing, but I think this comic speaks to that idea of like what you can do for your own sense of self and identity through tabletop role playing games, and that's part of what makes it all so special and so cool.
Yeah, games as a form of therapy is I think one of the aspects. And certainly when you're dealing with like Matt's grief over his mother, and like
Yeah.
how does that manifest when he first gets sucked into the game versus 25 years later when he has like gotten over all of this, but now he's, now people are bullying him. They're like, you need to get sad. You need to get as sad as you possibly can because we need you to go kill this big monster, and you can't do that unless you are like the saddest you've ever been, using the game as a therapy tool. It's good, but I also kind of like that they can, that sort of metaphor shows that like using the game as a therapy metaphor can also be a little bit dangerous. Like,
Totally. Yeah.
again, when you, obviously this is an extreme case where people are like, no, we're literally going to die if you don't get just like as sad or angry as you possibly can. But it's, Matt was a character that I had connected with very deeply because, like, I didn't lose my mother when I was like 8, but certainly like this idea that things that happen in the real world can impact your gaming experience, and the struggles of trying to keep the real world out versus in is so fascinating. And yeah, I don't know. That was a character that I just like kind of really connected with on a surprisingly deep level, and
Mm.
I really shouldn't have been surprised because I was like, he's a pretty minor player over the course of the first volume, and then kind of as it goes on, you're like, oh, I'm deeply emotionally invested in all of these people, but like especially you now.
Right. Right.
The nature of the party element is so fascinating in that sense because just like in almost anything, it's like you're going to have the different characters that you connect to.
Sure. Sure. And what I think is what I found very interesting rereading it again was just looking at the different classes of all the different characters and just really thinking about like what those classes mean and how it's commenting on Dungeons and Dragons as a whole, right? Or tabletop
Mm-hmm.
as a whole, right? Like
Yeah.
the idea of like Matt starting off as the grief knight and then realizing he's actually just angrier more than he is
He's
sad.
so mad at everything
Yeah.
is yeah,
Which is
and again, Chuck being the fool and just being like, I can do whatever I want, but then you find out that it's like, oh, the reason he thinks that he can do whatever he wants in this context is because he's dying and has, less than a year to live, so he's like, I might as well do the most reckless things
exactly.
imaginable. And all of a sudden it's like, because you don't find that out until I want to say like halfway through volume 3 or like 3/4 of the way through volume 3. You find it out pretty late in the story, and you're
I
like,
believe
oh,
so.
that recontextualizes every like shitty thing that you did over the course of the last 12 issues or something.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
the Neo as a metaphor for kind of addiction, and
Yeah,
not necessarily in the case of Angela, but like the idea that Angela is using this to again kind of escape a pretty shitty situation that she has, where she's like, I can't like constantly chasing, the fair gold being a metaphor for like you're constantly trying to chase after this next job that you can possibly have. I'm a
right.
freelancer. I understand that feeling. But,
I did just
yeah,
want to say because somebody in my comments asked what we were discussing. We were discussing the comic Die by
yes.
Stephanie Hans. Yeah, and also the going back to the addiction metaphor with the fair gold. I also think the fact that she exists in this like cyberpunk binary brings up this interesting idea about addiction, which is like it's all or nothing, right?
Oh
Like it's
God.
0 or it's a 1. You're
Yeah.
either you in order to not be an addict, you have to totally cut yourself off from things
Mm-hmm.
you can be addicted to, and the difficulty of that, and just the sort of like, oh boy, the idea of something being all or nothing is so overwhelming in a world full of nuance.
Yeah, and again, going back to sort of people are constantly having to look at her and be like, no, you're going to have to indulge in your addiction right now.
Right, right. Oh, oh dear.
Like, we need you to solve a problem, so you're going to have to indulge in your addiction. And then when the puppy goes away, like having the puppy, and then when the puppy has to go away, it's like just genuinely the saddest thing I've ever read
Right,
because
right.
it's a puppy, and then it's also Angela like trying to let go of the addiction. Angela constantly having to be like, no, I'm not going to get rid of the puppy again. I can't do it.
Right,
It
exactly.
is tough. That's a tough one. That was a rough scene.
The comic is full of brutal, rough scenes like that. There's a lot of like you're
Oh,
really getting your teeth kicked
it's
in.
I made the joke of like, do you like just being sad? Go read this. This is real sad. Like we're just gonna like sit in the sadness of it all. Um, the one thing that I definitely like wanted to comment on, and I'm gonna kind of use, I kind of wanted to use character moments because the interesting thing about this book is, for as much of like a classic D&D adventure as it is, there's not a ton in terms of like action sequences,
Yes.
which is surprising, and I think that's a, obviously I think that's a very deliberate choice on both the part of Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans, which we haven't touched on Stephanie Hans yet, but like this is a very pretty book.
It's
Stunningly pretty.
it's funny that you say that though, because the way her art style is beautiful to look at, but there is also something about it that like has this sort of, even though there aren't any action scenes, like a lot of the book is political drama in a sense, whether it's literally political drama or internal party politics. It's a very character driven story more than anything. But the way that she draws it, it gives this, it's stunning to look at. So you're not thinking about the fact that you're not getting action sequences, because just like panels of two people talking are like some of the most beautiful sequential art you'll ever see in your life.
It's like, it's just, it's, but it's also, no, I need you to finish your thought now.
sorry. Yeah, it's basically like, even though it isn't action packed, there is this sort of propulsive nature to it where you're like, I'm so blown away by what I'm seeing. I need to go to the next page because I don't know what stunning image she's going to hit me with next.
Yeah. Well, and I think the biggest strength that she has is, I don't think, and I'm not here to criticize other people's comic art because I can't. Comic artists do things that I would never be able to do. Sure. It never feels like she's drawing characters in posing. It always feels like there's a sense of motion to whatever it is she's drawing, even if it is just two people standing around having a conversation. There's always, camera angles will shift, and we'll pull focus into specifically a face and then pull back out of it. There's always this sense of, there's never like a shot counter shot moment in this book. There's always a new angle with which to look at things, which I think maybe speaks to the metaphor of the book a little bit.
Yeah.
The political intrigue that you brought up is absolutely a thing, because I think certainly as we kind of get into, once you sort of meet characters like Zamorna and the role that specifically, is it Charlotte that's the Bronte sister in this?
I believe so. They all start to mush together in my head after a while.
Yeah. As sort of the jailer, and as they sort of take Angria, but they take it all through soft power, which is another thing Kieron Gillen is just so wildly good at. Only Kieron Gillen could make the concept of gerrymandering deeply. I finally finished his Eternals run, and I was like, only Kieron Gillen could make gerrymandering so fun to read.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but that was absolutely what happens in that
book. That's another great book that I can't talk about because I'm still sitting with it.
We're gonna have to circle back to this when Judgment Day comes out.
Yeah.
But it gets me heated when people are like, oh brother, Eternals versus Avengers versus X-Men, this seems dumb. I'm like, do you know who's writing this? Have you read any of the build up to this? This shit's gonna go off. It's gonna rule.
Yeah, it's like this is going to slap so hard.
Yes.
Like, this is the first time I've been excited for like a big company wide event in probably since Empire.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
Just because that creative team is so good. Anyways,
yeah.
you know, I think adding in again the political element that is so fascinating, and once you kind of throw in Ash, you've got to go talk to your ex-boyfriend who's also a vampire and also like your child. You have to go talk to your ex-boyfriend and your kid. Oh, also your kid that you had illegitimately because your vampire boyfriend was dating Izzy at the time is, I think the explorations of trauma through the like that's a great moment of sort of like you deal with both inner party politics and then you
Yeah.
also deal with the politics of the world as it exists.
And there's a degree of existential horror to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like rereading this and thinking about like what they went through and then going back to just being like kids again. It's fucked
Yeah,
up.
it's deeply deeply terrifying. And then of course once you get to the point where Ash is like, well, now I have to keep Zamorna on a leash and
Yeah.
I can't use my power, the one power that I really have other than my like magical death touch. Like the way that I feel so cut off from everybody else because I'm having to use all of my power to maintain all of my political power is so fascinating.
Right.
Again,
Exactly.
a deeply political book that I'm like, I feel like every time you go back and reread it, you're like, oh, I'm picking up new political nuances. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's an incredible work. And it's one of those comics that, you very you very often I find with comic books, you'll come across something where like it runs for a while and it's a great series overall, but there's like patches where you're like, this wasn't maybe the best, or like it gets better after this point. I think that keeping it to only like 4 volumes, 20 issues, I think helps, but it's like this is a banger straight through. I
yeah,
can't
it's
think of an
like
aspect of
there's not a there's not a bad panel in this book. Again, huge shout out to Stephanie Hans and Clayton Cowles, who I think do
totally.
just do phenomenal work from top to bottom. I was like, I'm trying to think if there's any last little bits that I like really want to touch on.
Yeah. Well, what do you
Oh,
feel? I guess to kind of like start wrapping up, like, what do you
mm-hmm.
feel like to you is ultimately your biggest takeaway from this book? Now that you've like reread it through, like, what do you feel like to you is the larger one of my four answer to this comic itself?
Yeah. So now
That's a big question.
I just have to solve game theory, and then I'll get back to you. No,
What's your subjective solution to
yeah. I, I think at the end of the day, for me, the what am I for? It the I mean, again, the answer is different for everybody in the book. Um, but I think at the end of the day, it's this sort of question of like at the end of the day, it's about community. We play games to build communities. We play games to find community within ourselves. We play games to strengthen our communities. We might play games to weaken our communities, but it's all about how the game interacts with the community and how the game interacts with the players is kind of the
Mm.
core question of the book, and the game interacts with everybody differently.
Yeah, that's such a good point. This idea of you play the game, but in a sense, the game plays you. Right?
Yeah.
There's two sides to that, and that is such a unique
Well,
experience that you
and
can only
the
get through tabletop role playing games.
and that final panel is kind of
Yeah,
like the ultimate version of that, where you're like, no,
yeah,
the game is still gonna come in. We should probably say it's like if anybody has not read the book but is somehow still listening to this, the ending it basically reveals that in 2020, again, Kieron Gillen, you sly bastard, the world of Die and our world is basically going to collide, and they're going to like
yeah,
become one world. Saul, the sort of initial game master, they inevitably get out. Chuck ends up dying because Chuck ends up sacrificing himself. Again, the sort of like last reckless move of the
right.
fool is like sacrificing himself so that Saul can reattain his power and they can get out. And then it's revealed that no, the game world is still crashing. This is the first time I think I read something that like this is gonna be really sad. This is I think the first time I've read a comic where it's like COVID is a is referenced
Yeah,
like at the end, like they
yeah,
come back and it's 20 like it's sad and kind of terrifying, but
yeah, yeah. And I
it was
think
like
that's
that was a shock to my system.
no, I agree with you completely. I remember getting to this volume and being like, "Oh shit!" Like, but it's the kind of thing where like I don't know how far in advance he had the ending planned, but if it takes place in
Mm-hmm.
ostensibly the real world, it has to be addressed in some capacity. But I also think thematically it works well because it emphasizes just like what a shock to the system it is for them to return to this world. And
Oh yeah, no, it's a really good solid ending, and yeah, it's exactly the shock to your system thing. I need to grab my phone charger really quick. I realize we're probably not going to have this much longer, but it's
it's all good.
so.
It's all good. Do, 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 do. How's everybody doing out there? Thanks for joining us today. Oh yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. That this has been a wonderful
Your
discussion.
comment about the first time that you've seen COVID acknowledged, and that's I cannot stress enough how happy I am, not for escapism reasons, but just for like general reasons that DC Comics and Marvel Comics have not made any attempt to make COVID-19 canon.
Yeah, no, like the cute little like heroes at home stuff has been nice, but like
Yes.
I don't need Krakoa to create a drug to solve
That's
COVID.
what I'm saying. Like, it's one thing that 9/11 happened in the Marvel universe, but like, you tell me Reed Richards can't figure out COVID? Get the fuck out of here. There's
Yeah,
just
it's
no
like
way.
again, all these Krakoan super drugs and COVID still happen. That's so
Yeah,
lame.
get out of here. I'm just like, don't even bother.
I
It's okay,
don't
guys. We can take
I
an L
don't
on
need
this
that to
one.
be acknowledged.
Most of them wear masks anyway, so. But
Yeah, I had that moment. I've had that moment a couple of times where you're like, whoa, like having COVID acknowledged in your media that I feel like has so quickly tried to ignore it has been just like a wild moment.
it really
But
has,
other
and I
than
don't think
that, like
anyone's ever really done it well.
if you see the film Kimmy starring Steven Soderbergh, it like kind of does it well. Like the
Okay,
character,
interesting. I've been wanting to watch
the
that.
character, the main character of it, Zoe Kravitz's character, like becomes agoraphobic because of COVID, and that's kind of
Oh,
like a plot
interesting.
point. And it's like surprisingly smart. It does it surprisingly well. But no, I mean, certainly again the element of escapism. Dungeons and Dragons, you can play that online, and and the escapism can be just as real whether you're online or in person with somebody, and
Right.
it it adds that final little nugget on top of you're like, oh, yep,
I hadn't even
there
thought
it
about it until
is.
you just said this, but I would be very curious to hear Kieron Gillen's thoughts on it. I wonder if them returning into 2020, where in the middle of COVID, is almost like a wink to the idea of the tabletop role playing game explosion that happened during the COVID lockdown, where it's
Maybe,
like they come out of the game and they have to accept the fact that they're in the middle of a pandemic, which is what
yeah,
we all did.
it's like that's tough.
Yeah,
And yet it ends on a surprisingly it ends on a slightly hopeful note, you know,
yeah,
despite Chuck being dead and the implication that the sort of collision is still going to happen, you do end up kind of leaving with like, but these people I think are going to be okay,
right.
and that's important.
And
That is
as you
just as
said,
important as the world-ending stakes.
yeah, I agree. And as you said, it leaves Ash in a great place where it's like their journey is not pat tied up in a bow, and I think the way a lesser work would have it happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like they are now at the start of a journey that will hopefully get them to a place that they need to be at. But they weren't able to take that first step until they experienced what they experienced
Yeah,
in
yeah. I think it's just a good book, and I think a good book with a good ending is just always kind of where you want it to be. And
yeah,
certainly, you know, could it have run for 50 issues? It probably could have, but it probably would have also lost a lot of its steam. And so I think
yeah.
keeping that good tight 20 issues is a good thing. You know, would I read 50 issues of this? I would, but I'm glad that we have what we have of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you don't end it at 20, you don't get to be in awe of Kieron Gillen's cleverness.
No, no, you don't. Unfortunately, he's a clever guy. He's good at this. I don't know. I don't know what else to say. He really is probably in terms of the writers that are at present writing stuff.
Yeah.
He's probably like so quickly top of my list where I'm just like, I'm gonna read everything you write. I still need to read Once and Future. That's kind of my one big blind spot
Ooh,
for
it's
him.
good.
I've heard it's good.
And
But
Dan Mora is just like, oh, like no one's at his level. It's crazy.
My first exposure to Dan Mora, I hate to admit it, has been Batman Superman World's Finest. And
no, like, that's a great fucking comic. That's an okay thing to admit that's your first exposure to him. That comic rules. You know,
yeah, no, that comic does rule. I don't read DC, and I was like, I'm going to pick up these just because I was like, why not? I'll try these. And I was like, oh my God. Comics are good. Comics are good. Hot take.
Comics, now more than
incoming. Comics are good. And D&D is good.
And D&D is good.
And you should find people to play D&D with. You should find your people that you can play D&D with.
Agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will wrap there for tonight, I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna go play D&D right now.
Yes.
I'm literally gonna go play D&D right now. So I think that's a very fitting place to end. Thank you so much. This was so.
Thank you.
It was so delightful. This was so wonderful.
Yeah, it was. I love talking about comics in general, but I love talking about this book in particular. So, and I'm glad. Yeah. I love having the people who I feel like I always like and get comments from on TikTok, but it's also nice to actually like have a real conversation with.
I was like, whoa. I forgot. It's like, yeah, you're a person in my phone, but then you're also like a real person that I can talk to,
right?
Have conversations with.
TikTok.
I can look at you now and be like really jealous that you got to meet the Simonsons at a convention.
They were so nice, and they were all the money. They weren't even like charging for anything. They were just asking for Hero Initiative donations.
That is so wonderful.
It's like
so what are we ending on? We're ending on comics are good, RPGs are good.
The Simonsons are good.
The Simonsons are good. And all right. Well, I'm going to let you get back to the rest of your night, but this was so wonderful. Thank you so much.
We should definitely do this again when Judgment Day wraps up or something.
Oh, I'm going to have so many thoughts. I'm going to have it starts this week, so, go pick up Eve of Judgment in your comic book stores this week.
Yeah. If you've been like, oh, I don't know, Avengers, X-Men, Eternals seems dumb, you're a fool. Go get it.
You're a dumb idiot. Have you read Immortal X-Men? Have you read Eternals? Those books are good.
So good. And it's this upsetting thing where I'm like, I feel like a lot of people, and these people are wrong, but I feel like a lot of people didn't like the movie and then probably didn't give the comic the chance. And I'm like, the comic I think is great if you loved the movie, and I think it's even great if you didn't like the movie.
Yeah.
I think it plays really well to both camps.
And certainly I don't think, these are not popular characters. So no. Kieron Gillen had again, it in a very real way to what Jonathan Hickman did with the X-Men. I think Gillen did with the Eternals. It's just I gotta hit the reset button, but we're not gonna invalidate anything that's come before, but we're gonna give people something new to latch on to. And then you read the first 6 issues, and then you're sobbing at the end at that one page turn in issue 6, and you're like, oh, yep, no, this is great.
Wow, what a comic!
And then you go read Immortal X-Men, and you're like, again, a politic book with gorgeous art is just everything he's good at. So
yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say something, and you know me, so you know what a big statement this is. Kieron Gillen made the Eternals work in a way Jack Kirby couldn't, and I never say that about anything.
I have never. I've read very, very little of the Kirby Eternals, but I'm inclined to agree with you.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's that Aretha Franklin meme where she's like, "Great gowns, beautiful gowns." That's how I feel about the Eternals. Jack Kirby comics are art kicks ass.
it's New Gods, but not as good. And
yeah, that's pretty much it.
Kieron Gillen is okay, but what if it was as good as New Gods? What if it actually was
What
as
this
good as
comic
previous stuff.
presupposes is, what if it's good?
What if it's good? And this is good, and Die is good. So read
Yes.
Die, love Die. Play some RPGs with your friends, connect with people, and maybe you'll figure something else about yourself through
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. I do
Thank
have to go
you.
play D&D now, so
Take care, man. Take care.
you too. Have a
Bye
great
bye.
night.